Welcome back to Ranting About Nothing. Two things I want to apologize for is the sound of my voice. I have not a clue why, but it sounds so monotonous. The other thing is I haven't played that many pen and pencil role-playing games. I did once run a session of Dungeons and Dragons, so I don't know if that qualifies or not. Anyway, Halloween is coming quickly, so I've decided to talk about a horror-themed pen and pencil game about fairies. Okay, that may sound a bit strange, given the modern image of fairies today, but people may not know this, but fairies were once considered to be terrifying by people living back in the 21st century. You gotta consider them to be the modern equivalent of alien abductions and encounters. Now, there's only one game that better summarizes this ancient fear, and that is Changeling the Lost. It's part of a long-running series of, role-playing games once formerly called the World of Darkness book by the defunct White Wolf Publishing, now called the Chronicles of Darkness, now owned by Onyx Path Publishing. The first book in the series was Vampire the Masquerade, incredibly successful because of being one of the few RPGs that fully embraced the idea of playing as a monster, which eventually led to several other books being written within the campaign or setting of the world. So this would eventually continue until they would end the old World of Darkness, stopping to write any new supplements for it, and restarting with the new World of Darkness, rebooting several of their other popular franchises, starting with Vampire and then starting with other ones. One thing the series of the new World of Darkness was most famous for is having some really popular one-shot lines that they were only planning to do only a few books of and continue with their other main book. One of these was the reboot of Changeling. Now, back in the old World of Darkness, Changeling was originally called, Changeling Dreaming. It dealt with the idea of playing as fey creatures, reborn in human body, trying to survive in the modern age, from both fantastical and mundane danger. However, the most frightening thing to Changeling is mundanity, or banality, whatever you want to call it, which is where a fae basically dies and forgets about what they will truly were and just become a regular human being. And this is due to the fact that the modern age is a dull and dead world with no imagination or creation. So in basic terminologies, they basically grow up. This setting for World of Darkness rather divided the player base. Some players really loved the idea of playing as fey creatures trying to survive in a dead world while trying to find imagination and wonder in it, while other players really didn't thought it suited the theme or even style of World of Darkness and just thought it was kind of silly. So when it came for the time for basically the reboot for Changeling for the new World of Darkness, the folks at White Wolf decided to take Changeling Dreaming to a back alley and beat the living daylights out of it for being so bloody happy and cheerful. And also for an extra measure, gave it a Clockwork Orange sort of re-educational stuff. And out of this bloody mess came Changeling the Lost. In this game, you play as a changeling, someone who was once human but now is something more fey-like, due to the fact that they met one of the true fae. Basically think of the Other Mother from Caroline, or in other terminologies, basically a human trafficker with godlike powers who only views humanity as something as an entertainment. You languished for a long time in the realm of fairies, known as Arcadia, before you eventually escaped and traveled through something called the Head, a magical barrier between the human realm and the fairy realm. But when you go back home, you realize that no one actually noticed that you were missing, because the fairies, or true fae I should say, basically replaced you with an artificial version of yourself. If that wasn't enough to deal with, you also have to deal with other fellow changelings who are still working for the true fae, and also shape-shifting creatures known as the Hunt, which I'm probably getting wrong. Basically almost nigh unkillable shapeshifters who can take on any sort of form. So we have the premise out of the way, so let's discuss what makes a changeling. The first thing is kith. This describes the time that a person had in fairy and what mark it left on them. Also, what kind of role they played within fae society. Firstly up, we have the beast. Now, these unfortunate folk were forced to back into their animalistic state. This simply could be due to the fact that you found yourself being hunted by something in a screaming jungle, or in a harsh and unforgivable environment like a crevasse that never gets sunlight. Or you could have just been a simple farm animal, or even a creature of burden or entertainment. There's also the unfortunate darklings. These individuals got themselves lost within the Fey realm, and especially within the darkness, which, like everything else in the Fey realm, has a mind of its own. Or you could have just simply broken a rule that you never know about, like simply wandering off a path or eating something or even drinking something that you didn't know you shouldn't drink. And for this you were punished by serving your Fey master as a spy or an assassin, or at worst you were simply thrown away and locked away in a prison for your punishment, just to be simply forgotten. All changelings experience some kind of loss, and none know this better than the elementals, as their humanity was stripped away from them as they were forced to be reshaped into forces of nature or inanimate objects, maybe to power something for their Fey master, or simply to be added to their collection, or maybe they were twisted artists who like to sculpt flesh into something completely different, or maybe they just needed a new plant for their garden, or just someone to permanently watch over and be their permanent guardian for all eternity. Changelings are not above from throwing shit at each other, and none more so than the Fairies. Many changelings look down upon the Fairies, not believing that they had a hard time as other changelings did in the fairylands. And this may be true, given the fact that many of the Fairies were mainly kept around for their beauty, as either as inspiration, singers, dancers, or even as a status of wealth. However, many more of them might have been sex slaves, or to some other form of abuse, and some more of them might have not even been considered by their Fey keeper as being beautiful, and might have gone under some kind of surgical transformation to bring them into their beautiful state. Sometimes the abused become the abusers, and no one knows this greater than the ogres. These unfortunate changelings suffered great abuse while in the Feyland, sometimes by their Fey masters, who basically punish them for a failure of a simple task, hard labor that would have normally killed most others, but they forced themselves to go on, or simply through combat, maybe for entertainment, war, or for some other reason, maybe against another changeling or a creature of the Feywild. This unfortunately sometimes rubs off them in a harsh way that turns them into monsters of great fear and legend. Those creatures that have been known to devour whole man. To rip them to pieces was a simple chop from their hands. But others are also can be the great big friendly giant, a noble guardian, or even something between. Yet, despite this all ogres have to learn how to keep their rage in check. It is something that curses them all. Now, getting to the last of the seemings or kifs, I keep getting those two confused, is the wizard. The wizard, in many ways, unlike many of the other sort of seemings or kifs or what you want to call them, are probably one of the more simpler ones, probably less of the abstract ones, and that is simply they were the working class for the Fae. Despite the powers that the Fae have, they are still a bunch of lazy bastards who wouldn't do much to lift up for themselves, so they will usually kidnap someone maybe with the skills that they need, or simply force them to learn it, and these individuals become the builders of impossible buildings that should not exist. The cooks who have to cook foul meals that would leave many others was nightmare, and they survive it through all. However, all wizards suffer from a problem that years of focusing on a single task leaves them with an obsession for it sometimes, causing them to almost have a mental breakdown when unable to finish a specific task that they have. Nonetheless, they have proven to find this skill very useful when they re-enter the real world more than any other Fae. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'm sorry about the crappy quality, but anyway, I might make a second part of this. I'll see what happens. See you then.